Hi there, welcome to this lecture looking at the reasons for the ethnic differences in achievement. And this is for GCSE sociology. So just before I quickly jump into this, I just want to say sorry, my voice isn't quite itself at the moment. I'm not very well, but hopefully it'll be okay. So what I'd like you to do is have a look at this table on your screen. Hopefully you can zoom in and look a little bit more closely at the detail. This is a table that shows what's called the Progress 8 score, which is, if you like, the progress measure used by schools and government to find out how well schools and students are doing across the country. And what you have is there's a long green line going up and down, sort of slightly to the right of the middle. That's the national average. And then the blue bars going to the right and left of that line, they show you which groups are above average and which groups are below average, which ethnic groups. So using that information, I'd like you to answer these questions. Which 4 groups perform the best nationally? So which 4 seem to be the top of the chart, while which 4 groups tend to perform the worst nationally? So which 4 ethnic groups are at the bottom? And although I haven't asked you specifically to look for this group, I would recommend you have a glance and try and see where, if you like, the largest group, the white British group, where are they in terms of national average educational performance? So if you can note down those groups, just pause the lecture, note them down, and then we'll go on to the next question. So once you've got your 4 top and 4 bottom groups written down, I'd like you now to have a go at explaining why you think those gaps exist. I'll give you a clue. It's not because of natural intelligence in any way. That's not the explanation that we're looking for in sociology today. But what are the sociological explanations that you might be able to use to explain why there might be, for example, why the Chinese do so incredibly well, whereas the traveller community seems to perform very poorly? Okay, and also the Black Caribbeans, one of the bottom groups as well, you might want to write about. So again, pause it and write down some of your ideas. Okay, fab. So I'm really hoping you managed to jot down some of these ideas, okay? So I've got material factors, so materials to do with money, resources, so things like poverty would fit into that. And cultural factors, things like attitudes, norms, values, language, religions, traditions, those are cultural factors. But then there are also things like labelling, like teacher labelling, their judgments about a particular student's ability based on their ethnicity. And then there's the actual curriculum itself, what's actually taught in schools. What is being taught is that, to an extent, making some ethnic minority and ethnic groups feeling like they are not represented in the taught curriculum. And then there's also actual racism in schools, whether that's teacher racism, or what we're going to also look at is institutional racism. That is making it more difficult for students from, if you like, non-white British backgrounds to be as successful. There are extra barriers in the way because of racism, like I said, from actual teachers, or maybe even the structure of schools and education. And finally, the role of the peer groups, okay, subcultures, whether they're pro or anti-school. So how they might lead to some ethnic minorities doing particularly badly or well. Now, what I'd like you to do in your notes, I'd like to make sure you've got those 6 reasons written down. I'd like you now to identify which of them do you think are home or external factors, and which of them do you think are what's known as school, sometimes called internal factors. So you can either highlight them in 2 different colours or write home or school next to them. So have a go at doing that before we move on. Okay, great. And then one final thing I just wanted to mention to you at this point is that gender and social class also interact with ethnicity and a range of these factors above. So, for example, we know that black girls tend to do better than black boys, for example. So there's a gender thing going on there as well. But we also know that class plays a huge role in why some of these ethnic minority groups are not doing so well, because many of the ones near the bottom of that chart, they are from some of the poorest social classes as well. They're more likely to be working class, for example, or not have jobs or have very low paid work. And the reasons for them occupying, if you like, lower classes is generally because they've suffered discrimination in the workplace. They've either not got jobs or not got well paid jobs. And they've obviously suffered discrimination in education prior to that, which means they've not got such high educational qualifications to access those good jobs. So there are reasons why, for example, Black Caribbean, for example, are near the bottom of some of the social classes in many cases, and that's a lot to do with discrimination in wider society. Okay, so I'm going to go through each of these reasons in a bit more detail with you, if you can make notes as we go. So external / home factors, okay? So I'm going to talk to you about the material factors or poverty. So on the right-hand side, you've got another chart, another bar chart, and I'm sure you're really enjoying all the bar charts today. Again, have a go at zooming in, and it's giving you the weekly household income by ethnic group. Okay, so the longer the line, the more they earn each week. The groups at the very top, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Black African, Caribbean and Black British, they seem to be towards the lower earning ethnic groups. Whereas near the top, you got Indian at the very top, white, mixed race, and I guess Chinese, kind of above average it looks like, but only just it seems. So first question I want you to answer about this chart is, which parts of this chart do support the argument that material factors influence achievement? And I want you to explain why. Okay, so which parts of this chart do support the argument that actually it's material factors, it's money that's leading to these differences in achievement? And we know, of course, that money can or material factors can affect achievement, because if you might not be able to afford resources, you might not be able to afford to live near a good school, you definitely won't be able to afford to go to a private school if you haven't got material resources. Whereas if you are well off, you are going to be able to afford to access some of those things and improve your chances of doing well. Anyway, yeah, which bits do support that argument? And then my second question is there anything from this chart that suggests that maybe it's not just material factors? So are there any parts of this chart that don't seem to follow that pattern? Okay, so anything that doesn't seem to follow that pattern, that it's material factors alone that can explain why there are gaps in achievement by ethnicity. So have a go at answering those, and then I'll nip through some of the answers in just a second. So for number one, I'm really hoping, I'm sure you did pick out that the Indian Indian ethnic group, they seem to earn the highest amount, and that is reflected in the achievement chart we looked at before. You might need to scan back to the achievement chart before to answer this. So the Indians, they're the second highest group in terms of achievement, and yet they have one of the highest levels of earning in the country. So that does support the argument that actually maybe the reason the Indian community does so well is because they're a bit more affluent, they're a bit better off. You could also argue perhaps that Chinese do well because they seem to earn, just slightly above average earnings. It looks a little bit like they are, they don't earn too badly. However, it doesn't entirely support it, because we also know that Chinese seem to outperform all ethnic groups in terms of their achievement, and they don't seem to earn as much, so that doesn't entirely support it. This chart actually probably is more useful to argue against perhaps some of the idea that it's just money that makes a difference. Because if you look at the top, you've got Bangladesh, for example. They're one of the lowest earners. And they do fairly well educationally. They were the fifth top performing educational group, and way above average. So that doesn't seem to make any sense, Bangladeshi. And of course, the white ethnic group is down there as one of the best earners on this chart. And we know that they were not way below, but they were quite below average in terms of their achievement. So there must be other things going on apart from material reasons why these social groups aren't doing so well. But that's not to say that material explanations are completely invalid. We do know not having access to resources will make those groups towards the bottom of the social classes and make it more difficult for them to be as successful. But there must be some other things going on. So I also want to talk to you about some of the cultural factors. Now, of course, cultural factors, if you see that is talking about external or home things. Okay, what's going on at home? So a good example of a cultural factor is language. So language is, of course, the language you speak So this isn't talking about accents, and speech codes and how you speak. This is the actual language you speak. So in the past, Pakistani and Bangladeshi pupils were more likely to have English as a second language, and that did negatively impact their achievement. However, particularly the Bangladeshis, they have done much better of late. Okay, so language used to really affect these social groups, but it's perhaps not having such a big impact anymore. But yeah, if you came from, I'm not just asking about Bangladeshi or Pakistani there, but if you came from a background or you moved here and English was not your first language, why do you think that might negatively affect your achievement? Why do you think that might negatively affect your achievement? And once you've answered that question, can you also have a go at this one? Why might having parents... So imagine you speak English absolutely fine, but your parents are English as a second language, EAL. If your parents can't speak English well, why might that negatively affect your achievement? So if your family is maybe first or second generation migrants, perhaps, why might that negatively affect achievements? If you could answer those two questions in your notes, that would be absolutely great. Wonderful. So hopefully you've got some notes there. You've written about things like, if you can't speak English, you won't be able to understand the teachers. If you can't communicate well with the teachers might label you negatively. If your parents can't speak English, they can't help you with your homework. Your parents might not come along to parents' evenings because they can't understand the teachers, which might make the student feel like they don't value education. And the parents might pick a bad school because, again, they can't understand the Ofsted reports or the league tables to kind of make that decision because it's quite a complex system to choose a school. So those are all reasons why I think the cultural factor of language for some ethnic minority students might mean they do not do well. But I also caveat that with the evaluation that quite often English as a second language students who start maybe in primary school not speaking English, once they learn English and pick it up properly over a couple of years, they normally do very well eventually because they've done something really challenging. They've learned subjects in a different language and then they do very, very well later on. So that's just something worth bearing in mind about the point about not speaking English leads to poor achievement. Not always, as long as they've got enough time to catch up. So I also want to talk to you about parental aspirations. So parental aspirations is definitely part of your home factors. It's what happens in home. It's an external factor. It's how your parents view education. It's their aspirations for you. And particularly this is a strong explanation for why the Chinese community do so well in education. They are known for, Chinese parents are being very involved in their child's schooling. And their high aspirations, their encouragement for them to do well, them dedicating time to support during homework, them pushing them into extracurricular activities to help them get into good schools, all of these things really passes on much higher aspirations to the student themselves. Okay, but what's really fascinating about Chinese students is even Chinese students who qualify for free school meals, which is an indicator that they are working class Chinese students, they do incredibly well. Working class Chinese generally do better than middle class white British. So how can this explain, how can parental aspirations then explain why even working class Chinese students achieve much more highly? What is the big cause of them doing well? Because it can't be money. Money can't be the barrier that stops them doing well. What is so strong that it overcomes that poverty barrier of them doing well? If you could write that down on your notes, that'd be great. Well, hopefully most of you got it. It's values, okay? Values are what explains why working class Chinese, free school meal Chinese students still do well. Their parents clearly value education so incredibly highly that they will still encourage them to do well. They'll pass on the value for education. But also, quite often Chinese parents who don't have much in terms of economic resources and money, what limited resources they will use to buy revision guides, to pay for tutors. They'll use their limited money in that way instead of, going on holiday, instead of, moving to a bigger house. They'll use that money to try and get their child to do well in education because their values for it are so strong. So this last point is looking at the traveller and the gypsy community, which, as you can see from this graph, they're one of the groups with the, if you like, the lower performance against the national average. And this is generally about their external factors of culture, but it does link to what happens in schools as well. So I've linked this bit to both home and school factors. So Gypsy Roma traveller communities, they really seem to struggle in education. So what are the cultural explanations for this? Okay, what cultural explanations might explain why this community does less well? And there has been a lot of research done on this. There's been reports written on it and interviews done. And I've just sort of summarised some of the points from a news extract that we used to look at in class here. The first one was that many Gypsy Roma traveller students feel like outsiders in education. They sort of feel like school is not for them, okay? They feel like they're not particularly welcome in school. And quite often there's a complaint that the structure of school, the rigidity of the school day and the way schools are structured, like, sit down quietly, write information while a teacher talks, that really doesn't relate to their way of life. That doesn't relate to what's normal for them. So they struggle to sit and engage in those kind of like classrooms. And they find that much of what is taught does not really relate to them. Okay, so it's that problem with that ethnocentric curriculum again. Doesn't seem to relate to them, their history, their people. And many still feel that education will not open doors for them. They don't buy into that myth that if they try really hard, they'll be really successful in society. Because many Gypsy and traveller young people and communities, they suffer discrimination in society, they suffer abuse, and they don't believe that education is going to overcome that and allow them to become doctors, lawyers and accountants. Many of them do not believe those kind of roles are for them. So they just sort of say, well, what's the point in even trying? So those are kind of, yes, they're cultural factors, but they're to explain how Gypsy Roma traveller culture, how they might not feel welcome in school culture. So that's why I've said it is kind of a home, but it's also a problem with school as well. School's not very welcoming to the Gypsy traveller Roma culture. However, there are certainly other issues faced by the Gypsy Roma and traveller communities that can explain low achievement. Many of them suffer material deprivation. They don't have the high-paying jobs. They don't necessarily have high status roles in society. And yeah, as a result, that can lead to them not doing so well because they can't afford the tutors, they can't afford private school, they can't afford to live in a nice catchment area, or there is no traveller community within the catchment of a good school, okay? And also, somewhat to do with the culture of Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities, some of them still might move very frequently, although that is less so now. And if your community moves or your home moves very frequently, that means you have to move school. That leads to a lot of unsettlement, and that can also lower educational achievement as well. So these are other explanations also for why they might do less well in education. So now I want to start talking about some of the school factors, or what's known as school or internal factors, because they happen within school. And the first one we'll discuss is the formal curriculum. So the formal curriculum is argued to be ethnocentric. This is a key glossary word. I haven't highlighted it annoyingly on this PowerPoint, but please do write down the definition and highlight it. So the formal curriculum is considered ethnocentric as it focuses too much on white British culture and the successes of white people. That's ethnocentric. It's centred on white British to the exclusion of other cultures. So this doesn't encourage the self-esteem of students, okay, from different ethnic minority backgrounds, because there's a lack of pride taught about other cultures in terms of there's no other culture's real history taught, apart from we've discussed here before, that, you might come across the history of slavery, but that doesn't really give a student a sense of pride, perhaps, a black student sense of pride learning about slavery. There's an absence of other ethnic groups in terms of art studied and literature as well. Okay, although there is arguments that those things are getting better, it is still predominantly white, things like Shakespeare, Van Gogh, for example. And quite often, this can sort of detach ethnic minority students from what they're learning about. It can lead to them becoming really bored. because they can't really relate to it. It doesn't seem to be about them and their people. It's not a cultural experience that they can relate to. And boredom can lead to lower achievement because you're just not paying attention. All of these, the ethnocentric curriculum, if you like I said, can lead to boredom. It could also lead to like anger, if you like, particularly if you feel like you're being completely ignored, or you feel like your ethnic group is being covered in a derogatory way, and may lead to a level of frustration. All of these things are likely to lower achievement if a student feels them in school. I just want you to complete this activity independently, evaluating and finding examples of how the formal curriculum is ethnocentric. So I'd like you to explain how history, then English, and then languages may be considered ethnocentric. So that'd be 3 points you need to write. How is history ethnocentric? How might the English be considered ethnocentric? And how might the languages you study in school be considered ethnocentric? And then I'd like you to think of a fourth subject that is arguably ethnocentric, and I'd like you to explain why it is ethnocentric. I'm not going to give you the answers for this one. This is one that you have to work out yourself. So please pause the lecture at this point, and I guess it'll give you maybe a minute a point, so maybe 3 or 4 minutes, I guess, on this one, and then come back to the lecture once you've done it. Okay, great. So my second question, after you've completed number 1, is what impact might an ethnocentric curriculum have on students, and in particular on their educational achievement? So what impact do you think all of that might have on students? So if you pause it and have a go at answering, and then I'll go through. Well, many of those students might feel unseen, they might feel unrepresented, they might feel unwelcome, that kind of been made to feel like an outsider, and that's really problematic. They might feel embarrassed if, like I mentioned about the history of slavery, it might embarrass them to know that they were enslaved by the white British, for example, and they might feel angry. And again, these sorts of feelings, feeling unseen, unrepresented, unwelcome, embarrassed, angry, these are all really negative feelings. They can lead to, on an individual level, things like depression perhaps, but on a group level, they might end up feeling quite anti-school and turn to anti-school subcultures. So, yeah, definitely can have an effect on achievement because they might not feel like education's for them. Oh, sorry, I've actually mentioned it on this lecture. So they are far more likely to join anti-school subcultures as a result because they're more likely to gain that sense of belonging that they're being denied through the school curriculum. So if you could add that to your notes, that'd be great. So another school or internal factor that we've done a lot on this year is labelling. Which is to do with teacher expectations. So you guys probably know quite a bit about this already. So there is plenty of research being done that shows that lots of ethnic minority children are labelled as low achievers by their teachers. And a sociologist that you need to know for the GCSE, known as Cecile Wright, she did some fantastic research, particularly at primary level, about how teachers viewed and treated certain students from different minority backgrounds. And I've summarised some of her findings on this slide if you can make sure that you've got it down. So she found that at primary schools, teachers tend to ignore or didn't teach to Asian students. Asian's obviously a huge category of student that could include, Indian, Bangladesh, Chinese, Japanese. Asia's absolutely enormous, of course it is. But anyway, so these teachers weren't teaching to Asian students as they assumed they didn't have the language skills to understand them. So they often did not teach to them and they ignored them in class. So that would be really harmful as a young student. They tended to label black students as disruptive. And black students, and this is at primary, were often sent out more often. They were far more likely to be excluded. Okay, so that's how they treated black students. And this is an interesting one. She found that actually many teachers ended up offending ethnic minorities by mispronouncing their names, as this led to others in the students laughing at them in the class. And I feel terrible about this. I've certainly been responsible for this in my career as a teacher, mispronouncing a name. And that's what happens. If I do that, then the rest of the class laughs. So this is a real problem, Cecile Wright found, because it makes those students, those ethnic minority students, feel like outsiders, like they are different, like they're not welcome. And that, again, obviously really harmful. So how is all of this stuff actually really problematic? How are these expectations really problematic in terms of how they might treat ethnic minority students and ultimately affect their achievement? So have a think. What can teachers do in terms of their expectations and their labels that can have a real effect on how these different groups end up doing educationally? What things can you think of? And if you can just write that down. So hopefully you've made notes of some of these ideas. Obviously, teachers can put them into different sets. They can put them in reading groups. That's what happens much earlier on, in primary school, putting these different groups. So you might put Asian students in low reading groups because they assume they haven't got the language skills. Of course, all of this is labelling, but what labelling triggers is SFP, which is the self-fulfilling prophecy. So these students might start to see themselves in this way. Black students might see themselves as being naughty and start acting in that way. Asian students might believe they don't understand the content, so stop engaging. So the teacher is proved right. And this is really problematic because this means, particularly if they are labelled as disruptive, you're far more likely to form an anti-school subculture. So the other school factor that you really need to know about is what's known as institutional racism. So institutional racism is when an organisation's rules, laws and everyday practices are racist, but they're seen as normal, not racist. So the organisation doesn't realise it's racist, the people in the organisation don't see it as racist, and most people in society would be like, no, that's not racist. But actually, they are racist. If you come from a minority background, you might find some of these processes, rules and laws racist, but the white majority just don't seem to see it. So institutional racism is a real problem. It's difficult to identify, difficult to measure, difficult to spot. And there's an argument that, many institutions in Britain are institutionally racist, from healthcare to the criminal justice system to the police, of course the education system, which we're talking about now. So some examples you can use to illustrate institutional racism. There is a report from 2015 that found that black pupils are punished more often and more severely than white pupils. And they said that this was not because black pupils were more badly behaved. They said it was more to do with unconscious prejudice and stereotyping by teachers. So teachers had a much more negative view of black pupils and punished them more harshly as a result. And this had a real profound effect on their achievement. Obviously, if you're excluded, you miss learning. But black children were also far more likely to be put in lower sets than white students who had exactly the same ability. So you would have a data set, they'd have exactly the same achievement data as a white student, but the teachers would say, oh, they're probably not capable of doing better than that, let's put them in that set. The teachers would not predict that they could do better, and they would believe that the white students would do better. And they'd put the white students in the higher set compared to the black students, which has a profound impact on achievement, both in terms of the standard of education received, but also that kind of negative, almost like being labelled negatively by being put in a lower set. Here is some of the data on exclusions, if you want to have a zoom in and have a look at it. Quite often the highest exclusion groups are the ones that have some of the lowest achievement. So you got the black at 5.56, Black Caribbean is 10.46. You got mixed Black Caribbean 10%, Gypsy and Traveller 16 and 17%. So they're really, really quite high. Okay, bearing in mind, if you like, the white majority has an exclusion rate of around about 5%. So African Caribbean boys, this is just boys, are 3 to 4 times more likely to be excluded from school than other ethnic groups, particularly the white community. Another example to draw on, apart from exclusion, about institutional racism, is that teachers are far more likely to be white than from an ethnic minority background. We have a lot more white teachers than other ethnic minority groups represented in the teaching population, and that can just reinforce the view that education is a white British institution. And this is another really good example to use of institutional racism. Schools' calendars are structured around Christian holidays. Other religious holidays lead to mislearning, because if you do need to take time off for Diwali or another religious festival, you just miss learning. You're allowed to take time off, but schooling doesn't stop. So you miss learning. And another good example to think about is most exams are in the summer term. Sorry. And this can mean that many Muslim students who are fasting for Ramadan, they end up sitting like their life-changing exams during a period of fasting when they haven't been able to eat or drink since the sun came up. And if they've got an afternoon exam, that is a long time to not eat or drink before a big exam. So that can really negatively affect their achievement. However, in terms of evaluating the argument that schools are institutionally racist, the government did publish a report headed by a researcher known as Tony Sewell, who I'll introduce to you on the next slide. And he is a black researcher himself. That might be one of the reasons why they asked him to do the report, so it wouldn't be biased. Tony Sewell headed up this report, and he found there was no evidence of institutional racism in schools, and said that Britain was actually one of the leading countries in the world at dealing with and overcoming racism. And the report argued that it was actually more things like poverty were better explanations for why ethnic minorities didn't do so well, or culture was a better explanation for why these different communities were not doing so well in education. Something to do with their norms and values and their attitudes was preventing them from doing well. So we're going to just tap, if you can just make sure you've got a note of that evaluation, it's worth writing down. So we're just going to really quickly look at a bit more of Tony Sewell's research when we look at this sort of final school factor, which is the role of the peer group or subcultures. However, I have linked this to home factors. So one of the reasons why the male peer group is so important is because of some home factors that I'm going to get to in a second. So male peer groups then. African Caribbean boys do less well than African Caribbean girls. And some sociologists argue this is because of the dominance of macho or masculine subcultures in schools that tend to encourage rebellious behaviour and discourage success. Okay, so you guys know this really well. How might, if you like, rebellious behaviour discourage success? Like, what sort of rebellious behaviour leads to a lack of success? Okay, so things like being disruptive, being disrespectful, truanting. These are all rebellious behaviours, and of course they're going to discourage success because you're going to be behaviour managed, you're going to be thrown out of the class, you're going to be excluded, which of course is going to lead to a decline in how well you do. It's also not seen as macho to put your hand up and try hard. Now, many teachers believe all black boys are rebels, okay? They rebel against school. However, most of them are actually not rebels, okay? Most of them are not rebels. Most of them are what's known as conformists. Most black boys try hard. Most black boys do the right thing. But the problem is teachers seem to think all black boys are rebels. So what is this an example of if teachers are looking at black boys and assuming they're rebels, even if they're not? What's this an example of? I hope you've got it. This is an example of teacher labelling and definitely teacher racism. So Tony Sewell, I've got a picture of him there for you. He argued that the reason the male peer groups were so important to African Caribbean boys is because of their home life and because of their family type. Okay, so when we start talking about family types, this now becomes an argument about home, how home can affect how well you do in school. So can you remember from the family unit, if you've covered it yet, what family type is more common among black Caribbean communities? Can you remember? Well, it's lone parent families. And according to Tony Sewell, if there are lone parent families, this means that they lack a male role model. So then they start to seek a male role model from a peer group. And quite often that peer group will be an anti-school group, okay, where there'll be quite strong male macho figures. Because they lack that role model at home, they'll seek it from a peer group. So the subculture then gives black boys a male role model that they might lack at home. But it also gives them a sense of belonging in school as well, okay? It gives them a sense of belonging. And you've got to remember, why might they need that sense of belonging? Why might it be important to them for them to have it? And that's, again, back to that racism argument, okay? So another reason why subcultures are really important to black students in schools is because they face such high levels of racism in schools and discrimination. Whether that's from an ethnocentric curriculum or a sort of racially biased teacher, these students might feel alienated, suffer anomie, feel like they don't belong, so they seek it from these subcultures where other students who feel the same all hang out together, and they might be quite frustrated, angry and annoyed at education, which leads to anti-school behaviour and a lack of achievement. So I guess there's two reasons there why the subcultures are formed. First one is the lack of male role models in lone parent families for African Caribbean homes. But the second one is definitely in response to racism in schools as well. So this is what we've gone through in today's lesson. Thank you very much for listening. I've talked to you about material factors, cultural factors, labelling, curriculum, racism and the role of the peer group. And don't forget, gender and social class certainly interact. What I'd like you to have a go at doing now is writing a mini essay about this particular topic using, if you've got some lined paper. So this is kind of a made-up essay. So I would like to write firstly a paragraph explaining whether you think it's material factors or cultural factors that are more responsible for the ethnic gaps in achievement. And I would like to talk specifically about some of the ethnic groups that we've discussed today and from that chart that's on the right there. Once you've done that, can you write another paragraph, a second paragraph, explaining why actually it's racism in schools that better explains ethnic gaps in achievement? So racism in schools can include labelling as well and institutional racism. And then finally, this is the thing I'd like you to work on the most. Add a conclusion about which of all the reasons you mentioned you think is the most important factor impacting achievement, and why that reason is better than the others. Okay, try and explain why it's a stronger argument compared to the others. Thank you so much for listening and for putting up my croaky voice. I really appreciate it.